you're joining us from the East Coast. Thank you for joining us today for this, our final event in the PREFACE webinar series titled Sustainability, a Conversation for the Real World. Before we begin, I'd like to share a few general details. This Zoom webinar platform allows for only our panelists' camera and microphones to be accessed, but that doesn't mean we don't want to hear from you. Questions will be collected throughout the session via the chat and Q&A functions that you can find at the bottom of your screen, and we'll save time at the end for some answers. We are filming today, and the link to see the video will be posted on the PREFACE website afterwards, where you can also find more information about the other webinar sessions and our show participants. My name is Betsy Franjola, and I am the founder of PREFACE and the owner of Betsy Franjola Fabric Studio, BFF Studio. PREFACE is a fabric and trend show that we started 2.5 years ago. And as the name suggests, it is about the beginning. We created a space providing innovative materials, ideas, and a wide variety of inspiration to begin one's own design story or seasonal collection. For us, PREFACE is about building relationships and providing ways to inspire each other, not only through access to raw materials, but also through education on a wide variety of topics within the fashion industry, and specifically advancements in sustainability. I think it's important to be really mindful of the topic and prevent it from becoming a buzzword. So we believe it's important to continuously break it down and learn how we can make real and meaningful change. This is our 5th PREFACE event, but our first in the age of COVID, where we've had to adapt from an in-person event to creating a show in a box. We call them our experience kits, and they include fabric swatches from participating mills, our exclusive trend and color guide, and an invitation to this webinar series. So thank you for participating. Our guests today are unique in that they already have a very close-knit relationship with one another. So instead of introducing them in a traditional way, they have chosen to introduce themselves and share a bit more about how they know each other. So Lynda, why don't we start with you? And don't forget to unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you. And hello to everybody, and thanks for joining us today. So I'm Lynda Grose, and I'm a mainstream designer by background, and now chair of fashion design at California College of the Arts. And I know Annie because she was one of our students over a decade ago. And I know Domenica because she approached us as a program with a focus on sustainability to partner or become involved with her initiative called Global Action for Sustainability. And with both of these women, I would say I've been impressed from the get-go and consistently since with their vision and commitment and dedication and passion, and just at this unrelenting stepping forward. Like I would describe it as a force. Like they just drive forward no matter what and which direction, even as they are seeking out, you know, what to do next because they've encountered something that's, you know, has discomfort with it. So I find it really inspiring and hopeful to be around these young women.
Lovely. Annie, do you want to go next?
Yeah. Wow, Lynda, thank you. Welcome, everybody, and thank you so much, Betsy and PREFACE, for having us today. My name is Annie Gullingsrud, and I'm in California. I serve as a Chief Strategy Officer for a company named Eon, who creates digitized, connected products for circular economy. I now consider myself, my background is in design, but I consider myself a systems-based designer now. I'm also an author. I'm a fashion environmentalist, and I'm working towards being an intersectional environmentalist. I'm also a mother to a 3-year-old, and I'm a lover of indigo. And yeah, I met Lynda, oh man, the best day of my life. I met Lynda and I spent my entire career trying to impress her. Yeah, she was my professor at CCA, and the moment that I met her, I knew I wanted to do what she taught, and she became my mentor and has continued to be my hero. She wrote the foreword to my book, and you know, Linda's curiosity and humility and willingness to evolve and change has always just been such a inspiration to me, and I try and follow suit too. And I met Domenica through Lynda at Sustainable Cotton Project's Cotton Tour. And when I saw Domenica, I was like, who is this beautiful woman who has the career that I want? And since then, Domenica and I have become close friends, and we're also authoring a book together that's centered around presenting more of a mindfulness framework for individuals who want to change the fashion industry. And I'm honored to be with you all today.
Thank you, Annie. And Domenica, let's move to you.
Yeah, hi, I'm Domenica. As everyone can probably tell, it's a mutual admiration society we have here. But yeah, I've filled many roles in the fashion industry over the last decade plus, and kind of varying between both nonprofit side and creative. And but sustainability has been kind of a thorough theme throughout. And today I work mostly as a creative director, but also on sustainability projects, mostly focusing around education and providing companies with tools to help them become more sustainable, including the CFDA Guide to Sustainable Strategies and a course curriculum for parsons. As Lynda mentioned, I first met Lynda when I was just starting a nonprofit in San Francisco, and I was 23, and she was just, she was and still is just kind of this sustainability rock star, industry icon. I have similar feelings to Annie. I feel like she's very much an idol, and someone I just have such deep respect for, someone who's really informed my thinking, and someone who I feel very honored to have a friendship with. And Annie, as she mentioned, we're working on a project together, but yeah, we first met, I guess we first saw each other on the Cotton Tour, and then I got to know her a little bit better when she was working at Cradle to Cradle and really developing a toolkit and resources for designers that I thought were really deep and interesting around circularity. She really created that conversation. And both of these women, their books are my top recommended books for people who want to do sustainability and learn about sustainability, because Lynda's is very much about design, and both of them are about design, but just really beautiful books everyone should read.
Thank you so much. Well, the three of you have definitely formed a really amazing community that is powerful and inspiring, and we're so grateful to have you here with us today. The title of today's panel, A Conversation for the Real World, came out of one of our initial discussions about a month ago, when I kept using the phrase, in the real world. And Lynda, I think it was you that called me out and you stopped us, and we had a really nice little chat about what that phrase means. So let's take a minute now and share what the real world means to each of you. And Lynda, let's start with you again and unmute yourself.
Yeah, so I think that impulse to call you out comes from a sensitivity of working in this industry and being really committed to change, and then bumping up against the existing systems that resist and they're unyielding to change. And if you're in a designer position, and even if you're in a design director position, there are people above you, right, who might say, and often do, and haven't all of us experienced this, where someone either literally or metaphorically pats you on the shoulder and says, well, that's, great passion, Lynda, I'm really glad you're so passionate about this, but in the real world, and then of course they mean that the real world is the business world. And over the years, I've become more confident in being able to say, well, wait a minute, what's your real world? Because my real world, there's global warming and there's people that are oppressed, and I want to deal with that. And so for me, I think the real world is the context that business sits in, which is ecology and human, well, all species wellness, including humans. It's the context for business.
And Annie, how about you? What does that mean, that phrase mean to you?
Yeah, so it made me think of a story from when I began my career. I rode my bike down the street in San Francisco to this large company to interview for a design position. And they looked through my portfolio, which was very, very strategic conceptually from a sustainability perspective. And they just like sort of looked at me and laughed. And I heard "scram, get out of here," but they didn't actually say that. I knew I didn't belong there. And I also knew that that wasn't the real world that I wanted to participate in. And I remember leaving that interview weeping on my bike, and I was just weeping. And I think I was weeping for that company more than I was weeping for myself, because I knew I would find a place. And the place that I was sitting there crying was a block away from the office I would eventually be in at Cradle to Cradle. So I think that I see the world, I think it's much more complex than this, but there are people who are in denial, and there are people who are willing to see the truth and the pain of the truth. And the real world that I live in is to see the pain of the truth. And without seeing the pain of the truth, and I remember when I was studying with Lynda, I was in a lot of heartbreak learning about the violence and the destruction of the fashion industry, just such heartbreak and crying. And I would send Lynda these long emails, but, you know, she said to me, let's link arms and go and keep walking. And so from that moment on, it was just like, continue to see, and don't get caught up in the pain, but continue to walk forward and to see. And I think that that is what the real world and what reality is to see where we're at, to be willing to face the truth of where we're at about, you know, the environmental violence, the people violence, and to see it clearly. Without seeing, I can't design a solution. To see is to be creative. And so the real world to me is to see. And I can use my favorite part of me is that creativity. But if I can't see the reality of what's going on, I can't exercise that creativity to its greatest degree. So yeah, the real world is just to be honest and to move forward through the denial and the pain and the hurt, and hold that with me as I evolve and I help the industry evolve.
That's really powerful. Domenica, what about you? What does that phrase mean to you?
Yeah, I definitely, I feel the same way that Lynda and Annie do. But when a lot of the time when I like talk about the real world or think about the real world, it's actually it refers to kind of the discrepancy between what's going on in sustainability conversations and then what's actually happening on the ground. I think it's a result of me working on in both like sustainable fashion and then like not sustainable fashion. And there, as we all know, sustainability has become like the topic of conversation, which is, it's so different from, you know, when the three of us started our careers. But it really is this hot topic of conversation right now. And the conversations in sustainability conferences and among sustainability professionals are very deep and theoretical, but are so disconnected to what's going on in terms of what's on the ground in factories and where people actually need to start the conversation. It actually needs to start at a much more simple, basic level. And I think that we tend to, the reality is that a lot of companies just haven't even started or are just starting their sustainability journey. So it's really taking that into consideration and not just talking about big concepts, but really just talking about how do we empower people with on the ground tools.
Thank you for that. Next, let's talk about your individual journeys. It sounds like you each had a "this isn't working" moment, or that specific point or kind of aha moment when you knew that you needed to make a change in your career path. Lynda, let's begin with you, and I'm going to see if I can share these slides. Here we go.
Right, and I'm unmuted, right?
You're unmuted.
Well, I'm going to say, next slide and Betsy's going to oblige with that. Thank you. So yeah, hi everybody. My background, I said I was a mainstream designer. So I worked in London and New York before being recruited by Esprit and moving to California, San Francisco, where I still work and live and play now. And I moved to California and Esprit specifically at a very interesting time, because it was in the late 80s, and there was the fall of the Berlin Wall, and that really cemented a Western worldview, a lot of positive attitude about that occurrence. And then in 1990, there was an enormously successful Earth Day that really cemented for everybody, really codified our idea of saving the world. So these images represent that time. But the owner of the co-founder of Esprit, Doug Tompkins, was looking to bring sustainability into business and use business for change, along with his close friend, Yvon Chouinard at Patagonia. And I came into that environment. So next slide. And just to give you a sense of what was going on at that time, Doug Tompkins in 1990 placed an ad in the Utne Reader, which was a plea for responsible consumption. And so it was asking customers to only buy what they needed, and that we would adjust the business up and down accordingly, because we knew we would be contributing to a more positive attitude about consumption. And to be honest, it raised a few eyebrows at that time. And, we just shook our heads and got on with our work. But I joined, there were a lot of initiatives going on within the company at lower levels. And I joined an eco audit team that was looking at reducing the impacts of operations in the company. And because I was a designer, I started looking at the impacts of the product. So next slide. So that work resulted in a line called E-Collection that was launched at retail in 1992. And we really looked at, so this was an aha moment for me being in that environment at Esprit. And we were looking at what the impacts were, and then bringing viable alternatives to market, which included things like non-electroplated hardware and organic wool and organic cotton, and items made with artisans. There you see recycled glass beads from Ghana and so on. These are familiar concepts now, but at the time they were quite radical. And I would argue now that this is an approach that is not working, and I'll circle back to this later. So next slide. So after leaving Esprit, I became independent and started working on a number of projects, and have done ever since. And one of the major ones was the Sustainable Cotton Project, which is a nonprofit organization based in California, working with farmers to move them out of chemical intensive systems into organic and biological systems in cotton. Next slide. And we're well known for those farm tours that Annie and Domenica already referenced, bringing people from the industry on the farm tours, introducing them to farmers and scientists to understand what the challenges are of changing a chemical intensive system. And we helped popularize organic cotton early on, and it was on one of these tours that Yvon Chouinard made a commitment to doing only organic cotton at Patagonia. Next slide. And there's lots of insights that I got from working with the Sustainable Cotton Project, but the main takeaway for today that I want to emphasize is that this is one of the most productive cotton production systems on the planet. It yields 6 bales of cotton an acre. That's like 3 times the global average. Farmers have access to all the available technology you can imagine, from genetically modified to chemical help to machinery. And it's an enormous example of human innovation. Next slide. And yet, if you go down to the San Joaquin Valley and you take in the surrounding communities and reflect on the bigger picture, these areas, these rural areas of California, they're called Forgotten California. Actually, there's enormous poverty and enormous unemployment. It's 25% unemployment even during the harvesting time. So it can go as high as 85% unemployment when there isn't a harvest going on. And it really made me think, okay, what is this fetish with yielding more, and who's benefiting from these efficiencies? Because family farmers are still struggling to stay on the land, and clearly the local communities are not benefiting from this extractive economy. The next slide. And then I was on the board of Goodwill Industries for 8 years and able to witness in their warehouse all the discards post-retail of clothing, and seeing all this waste at the opposite end of the supply chain really made me question overall our fetish with growth, whether it's yielding more, producing more, designing more, and to what purpose when there's this volume of waste at the other end. Next slide. So by 2011, when Patagonia's ad, "Don't Buy This Jacket," came to market on Black Friday, it was a big shock. It sent some ripples through the industry and certainly through the retail sector. But as a designer in the industry, we know about marketing. And so, you know, "Don't buy this jacket," we know simultaneously says, "Do buy this brand." And that's exactly what happened with this particular jacket. It actually sold more items than ever. So that for me was a very big wake-up call. It was similar language to Doug's ad in 20 years earlier. So here we were 20 years later with a particular ad saying one thing and actually resulting in another. And it made me question what the intent was. And I found it actually very disturbing that an iconic brand would actually do something that actually results in the opposite of what it's saying it's doing. And I felt, I'm going to be honest here, I felt it was irresponsible because it gives license to other people to allow clever marketing to be enough. And of course it's not enough. So next slide. So Garam Vasalia, who's a co-founder of Vetements, he's completely outside the sustainability movement, but in an interview with the Financial Times in 2017, he called out brands who call themselves sustainable and criticized them for producing way more goods than anybody could possibly buy. And what he did was change that 20-year conversation about conspicuous consumption into one about conspicuous production, placing the culpability of unsustainability at the feet of the brands. So he's one of my heroes. That was an aha moment where he was calling out what was not working. Next slide. So just to reiterate this, you know, like you're making these observations, you're coming to your own conclusions, you're following an internal compass. And then every once in a while, there's another indicator that, actually, you know, the other people are thinking this way too. And John Elkington was one of those in 2018. He was the founder or the developer of the triple bottom line. And you'll have heard the triple bottom line in all kinds of ways talked about in business, you know, people, profit, planet. There's lots of synonyms around this. But in 2018, he recalled it. The triple bottom line. He recalled it and said it was being misused by industry. Bring it to the next slide. And what he said was it was never designed to be just an accounting tool. It was always supposed to provoke deeper thinking about capitalism and its future. So next slide, if we bring it back to fashion, when companies advertise or declare a sustainability gain, and it's framed in a way such as this sneaker has 25% recycled rubber, or you know, this jean has uses 30% less water, or by a certain date we will be 50% sustainable. What that means really is that the other amount, say it's 25% sustainable that's been declared, it means that 75% is unsustainable. And in a growth business model over the years or decades, as the company grows, that unsustainable piece grows more rapidly than the sustainable piece. And so I would argue that this is what we've been doing over the last 30 years. We've actually been losing ground on sustainability because of the incremental approach. And here I'm criticizing my own work with e-collection. Next slide. And the Pulse report, the industry knows this, the Pulse report in 2019 stated as much: sustainability initiatives can't be implemented fast enough to counterbalance the impacts of a fast-paced fashion industry. Next slide. So I just want, we were called upon to call out moments that were not working. So all of this seems, negative, but I just want to emphasize that I think of myself as a practical optimist, and as a designer, I've got innate, what would you say, innate trust in the capabilities of human ingenuity. But I look to a lot of economists and political economists, to see what other people are working on outside the industry too. And this image is inspired by Arturo Escobar, who talks about this real world, this world of the culture of consumption, as the one world, and says that we get sucked into this one world, so we can't even imagine other ways. And he encourages us to break away from this one world, start up other projects, these ways other, and to develop cultures and new ways of being around those. And so I have a couple of examples of breaking away for myself, and then one of another organization. So if you go to the next slide. So one way that I was able to break away, of course, was writing a book, Fashion and Sustainability Design for Change, co-authored with Kate Fletcher. And I found that I could put ideas in that book and get them out into the public outside of the constraints of the business models of industry. And so that was very liberating for me. It was also really nerve-wracking because your ideas are out there in the public world, but it was well received, so that was good. Another way, of course, is working in an institution, California College of the Arts, with young designers, and testing out potential futures in an environment where there's very little risk, because you don't have a business that's at risk, right? So I see colleges as incubators for new ideas. Next slide. Another way, as I was one of the co-founders of the Union of Concerned Researchers in Fashion, and we formed that really to provide a platform for another voice besides big industry. We found that researchers, with their integrity and their seeking out of the truth, didn't have a seat at the table, that the narrative is really of fashion and sustainability is really controlled by big business, and that there needed to be a place for alternative voices. And so that's been empowering for us and for those that are members of that institution. Next slide. And then in my own studio practice, what I'm doing is experimenting with ideas around designing garments to evolve over time, and in context with emergent business models that are looking at services. And so this one is knit swatches that are designed one way, and they've got invisible structures embedded into the knitting that when they're over-dyed, they distract the eye in a different way, creating a second sense of delight, and hopefully satisfying a desire for something new in ways other than shopping for a new garment. So that's where I am in my creative studio. And then finally, the last slide is just to say that I've been really inspired, just in awe really, of the work that Remake has been doing with the Pay Up campaign, which has really revealed the very, just the foul side of our industry, to be honest, where workers and suppliers who had finished garments were just not paid when COVID hit and retail shut down. And they've really been challenging companies to pay up. and been enormously successful. But what has come from this also is recognizing a need for a roadmap, a new roadmap, where the workers' needs are central. And it's coming from the workers themselves and the activists themselves. And I find that really hopeful, that the leadership is actually coming from the workers themselves. And they, you know, they know what workers need, and they're going to put that first and foremost. So I find that very inspiring. I'm going to end on that very inspiring note.
Thank you, Lynda. Let me see if I can figure out how to do this next screen share. And sorry, give me a moment. Okay, so Domenica, I think moving over to you. Oops.
Well, you can move to the next slide. Yeah,
Okay.
I was going to go over kind of 3 different "this isn't working" moments that I've had. The first is that there's a big problem with how we measure things. This has been on my mind since I was in college, actually, and I studied international development and social entrepreneurship, and I was looking at the ways that microfinance institutions were measuring impact. They were giving microloans to people to help them get out of poverty. And there was only one organization, Muhammad Yunus's Grameen Bank, that was measuring anything other than loan repayments to measure success. They were actually looking at like how people's lives were being impacted in terms of health and education for their children. And this has become a bigger deal for me as in recent years, it's becoming really clear that the metrics that we use to measure sustainability in the fashion industry are deeply flawed. Next slide. It's really important that we in the industry pay attention to numbers, but understand their limits. Obviously, we need to measure our goals and measure our impact, so metrics are really important, but there's no single metric that is comprehensive. All of them are kind of inherently subjective and leave things out. Next slide. So here are a few examples of the tools that we use in the industry. I have Caring's EP&L, Clean by Design's Meal Improvement Program, Life Cycle Analysis Assessment example, and the Hague Index. And to kind of go into the Hague Index as an example, they are probably it's probably widely used sustainability measurement tool that brands use today. And it's a really great tool. I recommend that everybody use it correctly. The more people that participate, the better it gets. But there are it's really effective when you use it entering in like all of your specific supply chain data. But when you use it more generally, it can actually be really dangerous. For example, if you are looking at the materials index without putting in your specific data, some fibers or some materials look more sustainable than others, and they might not be in reality. The tool also weighs different parts of the supply chain. The way it weighs things is fairly arbitrary. It also is, the Hague Index is one of the main sources of data that we use like we have in the fashion industry around sustainability, with which we use it to set our industry goals and sustainability goals. And the fact that it's incomplete, I think, could be leading us to set incorrect goals for the industry overall. So again, I recommend using these things, but it's important to maintain a sense of critical thinking and skepticism and to understand what's missing. Next slide. This is one of my favorite quotes. I wish I could read it all. It's longer than even fits on this slide. But it's Bobby Kennedy's quote. He's talking about GDP and how we use GDP to measure our country's worth. And he basically says that it measures everything except all the things in life that actually matter, which is true. Next slide. So Lynda talked about this a little bit with the fetish of growth, but probably at the heart of our measurement and general value system is the idea that bigger is better, and that growing is better. And both US policy and sustainability initiatives favor large corporations. But the truth is that research shows that small, local, independent businesses are generally better off across almost every single metric. To give a few stats, Data shows that as company size increases, pay inequality within the company increases. There's a positive association between aggregate wage inequality in the country level and the growth of the largest firms in the economy. And communities with a greater concentration of small businesses have greater levels of population health. Research showed companies with a vibrant small business sector have lower rates of mortality, a lower prevalence of obesity and diabetes. So even if you do work for an international corporation, I'd recommend that you adopt a local purchasing policy. It's a tenet of B Corp. And I recommend that we do this in our personal lives as well. Commit to supporting small local businesses and value them more. Next slide. This is just one example I love of on a personal level, kind of trying to ditch the idea that bigger is better and that we need to always be making more money and improving. It's Tim Ferriss's ideal lifestyle costing calculator, which allows you to kind of think of your ideal life and then calculate out how much income you need, which is surprisingly often less than you think. Next slide. To conclude, the thing is that you're going to have to make value judgments, which is why it's essential to know on a personal level who you are, what your personal values are, what your company's values are, and why you're doing what you're doing. Because in most cases, there is no black and white, right or wrong answer. It really is going to depend on you inserting your own value judgments. Next slide. Another big thing that isn't working, and Lynda touched on this as well, is that people and environmental sustainability are often separate conversations, and they've become even more so over time. But they shouldn't be, especially in the last few months. I think a lot of people have become increasingly aware of how climate change is also a racial justice problem. No race, not class is the #1 indicator for the placement of toxic facilities in this country. And communities of color and low-income communities are often the hardest hit by climate change. Next slide. When I first started my sustainability journey, I went to work for a company called People Tree, a fair trade fashion company. And the company's goal was to use fashion as a tool to help people, which is how we should be thinking about fashion today, but we're not. This list is a few examples of what our industry looks like. Next slide. One of the assumptions we tend to make in terms of measurement and people is that efficiency is always better, which is true in the case of, it works in the case of measuring things like water use or energy use, but it gets really complicated when it comes to measuring people and the impact on people. Next slide. So I wanted to use People Tree as an example. So instead of thinking about maximum profits, People Tree thinks about maximum employment. So they opt to use hand looms over power looms. It creates 9 times more jobs than running a power loom. It's carbon neutral, and weaving cloth by hand rather than on a machine saves 1 ton of CO2 emissions every year per hand loom. It also prevents urban migration, allowing people to remain in their communities and have a better quality of life. Which shows that a lot of the time, slower actually is better. I love this Kate Fletcher quote. She says, slow is not necessarily the opposite of fast. It's just a different way of thinking about things. So doing I guess being slower doesn't mean that we necessarily have to make everything by hand and have a really small company, but it does mean that we have to plan ahead, have relationships with our suppliers. And I think a lot of the time fashion functions at the last minute. Everything's always a rush, and that attitude really hurts people. Next slide. Last thing that's become increasingly apparent to me over the years is kind of the inherent power structure that exists within the fashion industry. And there are a few people who are really in charge, and they're often not in the conversations at all around sustainability. Next slide. I have a picture of oil here, and Annie always makes fun of me because I'm like a conspiracy theorist that always brings everything back to oil, but it all does come back to oil. We don't talk about big oil a lot when we talk about fashion, but they're intricately connected. synthetic fibers make up 62% of global fiber production. Polyester accounts for 80% of that. And fiber is only part of it. There are also the synthetic chemicals and finishes, not to mention transportation, packaging, and so much more. No one ever talks about the raw material source for synthetics. Patagonia will, you know, show you where their suppliers kind of show you the supply chain all the way back to the farm, but nobody ever follows the supply chain back to the oil refinery, or it always goes back to the mill. It's just like an invisible part of the supply chain. Oil ownership is concentrated, even though there are powers that be in fashion manufacturing. Like the fashion manufacturing industry tends to be a lot more spread out with thousands and thousands of producers over many countries, whereas the oil industry is very highly concentrated in the hands of a few, and often in the forms of patents and trademarks on different types of fibers. For example, Koch Industries, which owns many textile patents, and they own Lycra for many years, for example. So a lot of designers and people are inadvertently putting money into their pockets, which then are diverted through other channels, like their charitable organizations, to fight things like environmental protection and reduce, ease limits on industry pollution. That started really with DuPont, where my grandfather worked, but I won't go into that because we don't have time. But the environmental implications of oil are really hard to see, but they are really significant. We often don't think of oil as a conflict material like diamonds, but it is. Oil is on a basic level a main cause of war and global conflict. And then there's also all the stuff that happens after. Less than 1% of clothes are recycled into new clothes. And microplastic shedding means that we're all essentially full of plastic. So I think it's just, yeah, the fact that a lot of the powers that be that are in charge of this part of the system aren't present in sustainability conversations and aren't at sustainable fashion conferences really is interesting to me. It's like, again, an invisible part of the puzzle. So I'll let Annie take it from there.
Sorry, I was having trouble unmuting. Annie, go ahead and jump in.
All right. Thank you, Domenica, and thank you, Lynda. I love the conversation about oil. I see where you're at now, Domenica. You know, I had a career before I have my current career. And what happened was I was in that career and I felt like I was putting shit out into the world. And as a result of who I was at that time, I was depressed, unhappy, and feeling like I made no contribution and wondered why I even was on the planet at all. And so I had a problem, you know, and part of the way that problem shifted was I adopted a framework that I've since then applied to my career over the last 13 years since being in school. And the result of applying this framework or this methodology that I'm going to share with you is that I feel like a contributing member of the industry. I have had a very bountiful and interesting career with wonderful relationships, and I don't do harm. And if I have done harm, because obviously in 13 years I've done harm, I'm able to amend and change that behavior through this framework. And I can go to bed at night without anxiety for who I am during the day. And I have an integrated home life and an integrated work life that all align to the values that I have and the person I am in the world. So that framework is admission. It's facing a problem that I have or that the industry has, because without a problem, there is no solution. And as a designer, I always find problems. So what's the problem? And am I willing to see it? And then the second piece is to find a credible source of help. And to me, that's earth-centeredness and turning to the earth's beautiful way of functioning, its perfect way of functioning, that's symbiotic and inspiring. And it's turning to the earth to find help and power. And then the next piece, once I have that guidance and strength, if you will, and that inspiration, I search. I find out, where am I in misalignment with who I thought I was or who I want to be? And then I amend and I change. And I find out, like in the fearless searching, I find out where I had harmed. And step 4, I make changes and I amend that behavior, or I apologize. And then, much like the earth, the beautiful way that the earth functions is symbiotic. It's a give and a take. And so I can't just be in this world as a taker. I give it away. So for me, to accept is to give it away. And to be in a continuous source of gratitude is to offer it back. So if you go to step 2, slide 2, Betsy. The fashion industry has a problem. And you know what? It still does. And I realized back when I studied, there were many problems in the way that we produce, the way that we take, the way that we take too much, what we do with our clothes, how we treat them, how many we have of them, how we design them, and where they go. And we still have a bit of a problem. And we know that because there's still a significant amount of greenhouse gas emissions coming from the textiles and fashion industry. What we're doing isn't working. And so from that platform, admitting that we have a problem has been the source of a solution. So again, when I began this process and I said, well, the fashion industry has a problem, I had to ask myself, do I want to be part of the problem? Or do I want to be part of coming up with a creative solution? At that point, I actually couldn't be a part of the problem anymore because I had seen the truth and it wasn't a possibility. And I turned to, if you go to the next slide, I turned to the earth as inspiration. It's just, I love the bees. I love the way that the bees interact with each other and contribute to our world. And I've led an earth-led practice, career, life, and closet. And I couldn't have it any other way because it aligned with who I am and who I want to be. And that began with the way that I addressed pattern making in my thesis at CCA. There were too many curves. The curves had too much waste, so I got rid of the curves. And that was my zero waste pattern making methodology. In the next slide, I looked to the earth, and the Earth's hydrologic cycle is just so interesting and without waste. Everything goes back into the system. And I use the hydrologic system as a way to describe circular economy. So if you go to the next slide, the circular economy is an approach at which we look at design of material, production of materials and design of garments to ensure that they continue to be in the system at their most ultimate value and quality. That we look at those materials and products as assets in the system. And so I use the earth as inspiration to help me systems-based design products and materials. My earth-centered practice also led me to choosing to work with a lot of brands. If you go to the next slide, is I have a suite of brands that I've worked with that were centered around me aligning what I wanted to do with the companies that I wanted to work with, including the next slide, which is Cradle to Cradle's Fashion Positive Initiative. And you know, this next step about a fearless searching is asking ourselves, who are we? Who am I, and how can I be uniquely capable to help? And when I'm most of service, I'm happiest in the world. When I'm most myself and what I'm best at, I'm happiest in the world. And so I had to find out what is important to me and what has the universe made me to be, you know? And I feel like my values, I feel like they're very spiritual. I think they come from within and they make me who I am. And so I have these values that have carried with me. And so ultimately I'm asking myself constantly is, how can I best live up to those values and the person that I was made to be in this world? And that led me to Cradle to Cradle, Fashion Positive, as we created materials for circular economy, those materials that are best designed to flow. And it also led me away from Fashion Positive. You know, in the next slide, I created this with Stella McCartney, a very beautiful, perfect yarn. It was perfect. It was too perfect. And I kept looking at my values and how might I be in misalignment with some of those values. They worked for so long, but maybe that perfect yarn didn't have the ability to scale. Maybe that perfect yarn didn't have the ability to stay perfect as it moved through the circular economy. And maybe that yarn and those products on the next slide are going to get lost. They're too perfect. So I started to wonder, where are they going to go? And that led me to my next slide, which is the company I currently work for, which is really very much in alignment with particularly my value of not doing harm, but also this concept of scale to me is really essential, is how can I be the most impactful in the world, and how can the products and materials that we create provide the most value for the most longest period of time? How can we amplify and monetize, if you will, all of the hard work that you're all creating, and that investment, those sustainable investments are very expensive as well. Sometimes they should be. Not expensive, but they cost something because they're not hurting the planet. And how do we make sure that they have the longest life cycle? And that's what we do at Aeon. And just to wrap it up, to leave time for questions, the last step for me really is continuous. And if you go to the next slide, Betsy, it's really about a symbiotic relationship of, you know, myself in this world. I need to make sure that I'm giving, my entire life is about giving back. But there are certain moments in time that service became essential. My book, Fashion Fibers, Designing for Sustainability, I knew I wasn't going to get paid for it. So, as oftentimes authors don't. But it really was about passing on foundational sustainability knowledge and design knowledge to university students and industry, because it just didn't exist. It wasn't all in one place. I learned through worksheets that Lynda had created. And so using those foundational worksheets, it created a book that can be bought internationally. And then the last slide is doing service through Goodwill. Lynda was the reason why I joined the Goodwill board. So I joined the Goodwill board to be of service to that part of the industry. And it is a part of the industry. It's where everything goes. And they provide training to people who don't always have a chance at jobs because they were formerly incarcerated, and provide really important training for us to also keep materials flowing. And I'm also on the board of a really amazing company called Pangaea, who's doing wonderful things. And that's also an active service of passing on my sustainability knowledge to a company that's becoming a leader in the industry. So I'll just close with repeating, this is the framework at which I approach those moments of, oh my gosh, this isn't working, what do I do? And so I keep this process very close to me as I try and navigate and find a solution for change. Thanks.
Thank you all so much. Let's see, I know our time is getting a little bit tight here, but I think many here today are trying to figure out a specific plan for themselves or their company on how to become more sustainable and to do the right thing. I know you have some thoughts, and we spoke the other day about company bubbles and personal bubbles. We also spoke about leadership and where that should come from. And I thought we could maybe, I don't know if it's too much, but maybe sort of also tie that into final thoughts, and we can see some of the questions as they come in. But Lynda, I don't know if we start with you, if you want to talk a little bit about that. We can kind of have an open conversation about it, I think. And you're muted.
In terms of how to become more sustainable, I think it's looking honestly at where you are as a designer or a company, and identifying the issues and responding appropriately. And it's actually, I think it's quite simple. It's a really common sense. So I wouldn't get overwhelmed with all the different standards and all the different labels and all the different, things that lots of other people are doing. If you're looking at your own business and your own supply chain and suppliers, the answers are there. And act on what that tacit knowledge that you have, rather than a global standard that might not be relevant to a local condition.
Lynda, when we talked the other day, I thought you had a really interesting way of talking about designers' roles, and you'd use the phrase the visual form to show other ways. And I thought that was really powerful and sort of giving designers a sense of what they can do, because they might be working within this larger structure. But I don't know if you want to elaborate on that a little bit.
Thanks for reminding me, because when you're on the spot, you often forget those little nuggets, So yes, so designers are not always in a position of change, are they? Of being able to enable change, because they answer, usually it's the business people that have the power within a company. The people that handle the money. But what designers can do, because we make things, we bring material things to life in this world, and they can example new ways, because often the conversation about sustainability is abstract. And even the researchers, it can be abstract, right? But if you can take those theories, those ideas, and bring them into practice, then you've got an example, and suddenly people can go, oh, right, I see what you mean. Like once you see it, it's acknowledged. So
I love that, sort of helping people understand what they can do within their own sort of world where they are. And Annie, I know you touched on these two sort of phrases that I hadn't really thought about, but the company bubbles and the personal bubbles. I don't know if you want to elaborate on that idea a little bit. I think it was you.
I don't know.
Domenica.
Was it you, Domenica?
I think it's both of us, but I think it's you've talked about it a lot, Annie, about the way that we carry a value system through, like we have a personal value system, and it but there's a big separation between like our work self and our personal self, and so things that are we value, we might be be in a sustainability position at work, but not actually implementing those values in our personal lives. Annie, you might want to add to that.
Yeah, that's exactly, totally right. And I think that we're sitting here in a pandemic, and I think one thing I've experienced is this integration of my work into my family life, even more so. My 3-year-old was with me during work days. And it gives us an opportunity to reflect, or I should say, face the mirror that's been in front of us, to say, well, how might I be acting a certain way at work that I'm not acting in my family life? So one example of that is the way that we treat people in the supply chain. Would we treat our children like that? The way that we are going out, we're leaders of fashion companies, executives talking about the sustainability in our company, yet we have, we just bought a new suit from a company or a brand that has no ethics behind the way it produces things. So it really, particularly now, is an opportunity to sort of integrate and I think make some hard decisions about what it is we want to do, how we go about what we do, and where we go from here. I think Mara Hoffman's a fashion brand, has so many beautiful examples of the moment she's like, I can't do this anymore, and entirely changed the brand and the aesthetics. And the aesthetics are beautiful, much more, I think, modern than they were before.
I think that's really great. I feel like you just answered one of the questions that came in from someone anonymously, which was, in your opinion, which fashion brands are approaching sustainability correctly? I don't know if anyone else has a company they'd like to sort of call out as doing things the right way.
I think Tracy Reese is another one that's kind of similar to Mara, who, unlike Mara Hoffman, who was just shifted her entire brand, Tracy Reach actually like left her brand and started a new one, and really, yeah, came up with the opportunity to kind of earn more money through fast fashion and decided not to, and then went on a journey and educated herself about what other ways of doing business there were, and then chose a route that was really something that was really personal to her, and the way that she's built her new business is very inspiring.
Lynda, is there anyone that you've seen recently that you think deserves a shout out for doing things the right way? And sorry, you're muted.
Right. Well, rather than the brand side, what I'd like to do is that like call out, and of course people know them already, but Fibershed, for what they're doing, where they're working with local designers and also local ranchers, and they're connecting that work with earth systems and carbon systems. Because I will point out that they are excluded from some of the standards that are used in the industry. The standards that are used in the industry have become normalized and globalized, and they edit out locally relevant approaches. And I really admire Fibershed for standing its ground and doing great work and being a force internationally now, despite being left out of some of those standards. So yeah, that's it's not a company, it's an organization.
Yeah, I think that's great. We had another question come in from Dorota. Domenica mentioned the importance of smaller local businesses in the circular economy. How do you see current trends in reshoring and regional manufacturing play into this? And are there any dangers behind that trend?
That's a complicated question. I guess where the global fashion industry is interconnected and very complex. But I think we've seen that those local models actually can be better. For example, during this pandemic, we've seen a lot of really huge corporations struggle, and in ways that I was talking to Lynda and Annie about this the other day, but actually like a lot of the I live in LA, and a lot of the manufacturers here they're small and they're local, and during the pandemic, they've just totally pivoted what they do and shifted to making PPE and other things, and have a lot more agility, and as a result are all still in business. And I think that and like I went over some of those small business statistics, are supporting them just makes communities better. So I think whether you're doing that at home or whether you're doing that with the communities internationally that you work with, I think taking a small local community approach is the best. I don't know if that answers the question.
I think that's good. I know we had a chat the other day in our production webinar, and we talked about here or there, manufacturing locally or overseas. And I know one of it, I feel like this could spin off into a whole other conversation, but really it went back to the investment and whose responsibility is it to make the investment. And I've been thinking about this the last few days, and I feel like, it's really everyone's responsibility to do it. Mm-hmm. Everyone from the consumer through the suppliers, the entire thing, and also working back to our government levels who are setting policies that can affect some of those changes. But I think it's everyone stepping up to do that right thing. And Annie and Lynda, I don't know if you wanted to respond to that question also.
I have a couple of thoughts. So just circling back to what you said, Betsy, it's really important that we understand that it's all of our responsibility, because as long as it's someone else's responsibility, it becomes a scapegoating and people don't move forward. So it's really important that we all move forward in the ways that we can and keep linking arms and, raise that sort of awareness and understanding of the complexity of things, and even so move forward. So that's one thing. But there is one of the dangers of reshoring, of course, is then what do the workers overseas do? And, of course, we've seen with COVID-19 that, people are just out of work in the hundreds of thousands. And so I would say that the fashion industry in its sustainability agendas, one of the things it needs to be doing in terms of its roadmap for the future is, you know, retraining like new kinds of jobs, and what are those jobs going to be in these different areas. Because traditionally what the fashion industry does is it's manufacturing in China until it becomes too expensive, and then it shifts to Vietnam until that becomes too expensive, and then it shifts to Ethiopia. So it follows poverty, and then it leaves behind it this trail of destruction, you know. So how do we really responsibly plan? And of course that comes at the policy level. So, you know, getting designers out there with this kind of knowledge and at the table at those discussions. You know, the Textile Exchange is at the table with, you know, Europeans now, and Forum for the Future, and, you know, hopefully more and more designers are, you know, become at that level, so they contribute to those conversations and decisions.
Can I add one more thing? I think that the decision between here or there is really it's not again, like a one is better than the other situation. It really depends on your company, what you make, and what your company's values are. I think if you approach with the idea of doing no harm, as Annie mentioned, and again, working to empower the people in your supply chain, both can be good. It really is knowing what's the best fit for your company.
So I know we've kind of passed our hour. And so for the sake of time, I do want to thank each and every one of you sincerely for taking the time to be here today and share your incredible journeys, your knowledge, and your thoughts with us. We hope that everyone will leave today and continue on their own path to becoming more sustainable and making change within our industry. So to keep everyone moving forward, I wanted to see if each of you had some final thoughts or comments. And we're also going to post a list of resources for people on our Preface website. Lynda, do you want to start? Final thoughts?
Yeah, I think what I would say is, you know, when we were doing e-collection, Cradle to Cradle hadn't been published, Ecology of Commerce had not come out yet, and it was a process of common sense, of discovering what the issues were. We didn't even know that cotton grew in California at that time. I mean, we were truly making discoveries, and then, you know, deciding what the logical next step was, and to like trust yourself in that process. And again, I'm just going to come back to that Pay Up campaign. There was a moment where some of the activists and workers were saying, there's no roadmap. There's no roadmap for the future. Some business is coming back, but it's not going to be the same. There's no roadmap. And then it was, well, why don't you develop the roadmap? And it was like, what? Who else is more qualified to do that? So again, coming back to if there's a mismatch with the values that you have and a situation that you're in, you're the one to realign and to feel confident in doing that, and get yourself into a place where people appreciate that confidence as well.
Thank you so much. Annie, do you have any final thoughts?
Those were good, Lynda.
Oh, were they?
Maybe, yeah, those were good. When you were talking, I was thinking how there's a lot of space for leaders, and that when, you know, Lynda taught me to critically think. And I think that to critically think for me means reading. Like, I never stop reading. And also there's a line to that too, especially when it comes to the news, but to grow the brain, and then to see, like, there's new research reports and new scientific research reports that apply to us. So to read and to know and to think and to reflect and to say to ourselves, is this true, what we're doing? Is this okay? And that's a point at which I found a lot of information, just to constantly ask, is this right? Is this okay, the way we're treating these people? And then there's just so much space here for empowerment of us as individuals and leaders to make a decision about how we want to do business and how we want to live our lives, particularly right now. So I'm excited about that. I've always refused to do it any other way, and I invite others to, we're 4 people on the call who do it that way, and invite others to just keep questioning why we do things. And the world is changing. Fashion is becoming modernized right now, and it's up to us to make to create a beautiful definition of what that's going to mean to us, you know, and to the people around us.
Thank you so much, Annie. Domenica, do you have any final thoughts?
I guess second what both of them said, and I just think it's really important to make it personal, to again really align your personal values with what you do, and strive to have a positive impact where you can, and at least not do harm. I love Annie's framework. I think it's a great framework for everybody to follow. And I think, again, yeah, the idea of whose fault is it, who's responsible, we should approach everything as if it's our personal responsibility. We can't control everything, but really taking credit for our part in this system is important. Again, like Annie said, it's admission, but having a sense of personal responsibility.
Wonderful. Well, thank you all again for being here, and we're going to wrap up our session today. The recording will be on our Preface website if anyone would like to access it later. But thank you, everyone.